Wargamers. Welcome back. Purple Druid presents Wargame Culture, and today I am speaking with Fluid the Druid about some cool stuff he posted online regarding terrain generation for Wargames. And I think we've got some interesting questions and answers coming up, so stay tuned for Fluid the Druid and his terrain system. Hi, Fluid. Welcome to Wargame Culture.
Oh, hello. Thanks for having me.
I saw that picture you posted online, and I had a whole bunch of questions, and so I'm going to pop over there and get to my list, and I'm going to find out a little bit more about what exactly you were doing with that. So, what? Why? I guess first of all, why are you making terrain cards? Why not dice in a table or some other kind of random generation? What is the purpose? What is this for?
Well, that's good, really good question, and I think it brings up the mission creep that can happen in game design. This is not a complete game at this point, or a finished game by any means. But I'll give you the background of how it started. And so, several years ago now, James Raggi of Lamentations of the Flame Princess fame put out a call for people to submit ideas to him for products that they might want to sell. And in particular, he was looking for, he had this idea of coming out with a regular set of small folios of just like very cheaply printed, maybe folded pieces of paper, kind of pamphlets, so that he would have a regular product stream going out. And at that time, I pitched to him this idea of making a strategic game and a miniatures war game set of rules to go with Lamentations of the Flame Princess. And I did that because I felt like that game could use, it's centered around the 17th century, 30 Years' War era, roughly,
Right.
and that it could use some structure to it. The theme of that game is all kind of weird horror, science fantasy elements in that setting. And and he's selling mostly essentially what are module books. But I felt like I wanted a campaign game to go with it because there are some rules in that rule set, like for example, there are rules for keeping up labs to research magic and stuff that just never get used when you're playing modules. The same issues that we've seen playing one-to-one time alleviates this idea of these things that take long periods of time, whereas kind of module play and stop time play kind of routes around all those kind of rules. So I pitched to him this campaign game and miniatures game, and that the idea that thered be a pamphlet for the miniatures game, a little pamphlet for the strategic game, and then pamphlets for various factions within the 30 Years' War, like the Habsburgs or France or, things like that. With random generation tables for encounters and stuff during those time periods. And really it was a way of creating a setting where there's other things going on at the same time as the various modules he's printing. Because I know he's a commercial guy, he's selling stuff. That's the point, to sell the modules, but the idea was to make a structure where like, okay, here's a campaign that's going in the background where you can run your modules in it. And of course, I thought I could do it quickly. um, uh, but then COVID happened, a whole bunch of things threw me for a loop, and years have now passed. I'm sure he was skeptical of the idea at the time. I'm sure he's totally forgotten about it at this point, or thinks it'll never happen. We'll see if it ever does get done. But really, the basic idea was a very simple, just like we've been doing with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, scaling up from single characters to military units and using the same rules as Lamentations of the Flame Princess to fight them. And you could write that up in a short period, a small length pamphlet, and call it good. Of course, me being who I am, it then got bogged down in things like unit formations and stuff like that. But one of the first things was I was thinking about, I didn't want to have a giant hex map of Europe during the 30 Years' War and trying to replicate specific terrain for these battles to fight on. I had been reading books on the 30 Years' War and the battles, and they're all in very specific places. And if you want to be a historical wargamer and recreate those battles, that's one thing. But obviously, for a role-playing game, particularly where you're starting at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, obviously that 30 Years' War is going to go a totally different place than it did in real history. And the battles aren't going to be set at the same places as in history, or with the same forces. And so my idea was, instead of a hex map of Europe, was to have just a regional maps where, we got France, we got Germany, probably Germany broken up into several chunks, but regions. And you would move your forces into those regions, and then there'd be a set of rules for how those forces interacted, based on who the commander-in-chiefs were and whether they actually wanted to fight or not or whatnot. But if they did want to fight, you would then need to generate some terrain for the tabletop. And of course, I know you're familiar with chainmail, and chainmail has its own terrain generation where it's a table and people take turns rolling on it and placing terrain pieces onto the battlefield. And that was the general idea from the beginning for my system. However, working on it, I had this context where I also had the strategic game, not just the tactical miniatures game. And the strategic game idea, which was to have some sort of simulated economy, fake but simulated. And of course, me being odd, I had this idea that you would play a game of cards, and whoever won the hand of cards, well, that hand of cards would generate points. Now, and those points would be spent on things like troops and building forts or whatever, right? So it became a strategic game where you could place troops on the table and then move them around. And each hand of cards would be a season, essentially. And so, 30 Years' War, you'd go 30 times 4, roughly 120 hands of cards played. And so then I was like, okay, hold it a second. We should use tarot cards. And tarot cards are, of course, the famous cards that people use for various silly divination sort of things. Oh, the hangman means this, and the Seven of Swords means that. And so I thought it'd be humorous to use tarot cards, because there is a game of tarot, French tarot. It's just a card game. Apparently, it's the most popular card game in France. And it's just a card game. It's played, you play hands, you take tricks, kind of like bridge, but it has a different deck than our standard card game. It has 4 suits, and they're the same suits as our decks, spades, hearts, clubs, diamonds. Now, the old tarot decks have like swords and wands and stuff. Well, those map onto the modern suits. I think wands are clubs and swords are spades and whatnot. And but the tarot deck has more cards. It has 1 through 10 of each suit, plus face cards, 4 face cards instead of 3. You have essentially a jack, a knight, a queen, and a king. And it has jokers. But then it also has the trumps, 21 trumps from 1 to 21. And so the way French tarot works is, I'm not going to go into all the details of the rules because they're arcane and I don't fully understand them. But I play it on my phone. But basically, you get dealt a hand. There's some rules about making bids, kind of like bridge, where everybody does a one-time around bid of how many points they think they can get based on their hand. And then whoever makes the highest bid has to carry that out. And if he fails, he loses points. If he wins, he gets points. And everybody else loses points. And so at the end of it, at the end of a hand, every player has either won or lost a certain number of points. And so the strategic game, I was like, I'm going to base those points on a hand of French tarot, which I think is appropriate since it's Europe and the 30 Years' War and France is involved. And it's the sort of game people played at that time. And you'd have a number of economic points for each action within the game, and that the results of the cards would influence, add or subtract to those base points. If you're the Netherlands, say, you're going to get different base than, say, France, because they're a much smaller country. So I knew tarot cards were already in the game to one degree or another. And so as I started working on the terrain system, I starting basically with the chainmail terrain table that's in chainmail. But then I realized, like, hold it. At the same time, I was developing the tactical rules for controlling your armies in the miniatures game. And that was based on, in Lamentations of the Flame Princess, fighters are the only character class that gets a bonus to hit as they gain in level, because they know how to fight. Nobody else really knows how to fight. So I was like, just like with AD&D, I was like, fighters are the natural characters to be leading armies and whatnot. And so I set up a system where, based on your level as a fighter, you got bonuses for telling your troops what to do and getting them activated to do things on the field. And so I was like, oh, well, and part of that was each army had a commander-in-chief, and then you had individual generals running the middle, left, and right flanks. And so each battle would have basically 4 generals, one of which is the commander-in-chief. And so I was like, based on your commander-in-chief rank, I was like, oh, here's what we do. We look at the relative commander-in-chief's abilities, and that influences the cards the terrain that they could access. Because I didn't want to make specific battlefields or maneuver strategically about, to say, France and go, oh, we're next to the Rhine River and blah, blah, blah. I want to just like, okay, these generals have a certain amount of ability and they're jockeying for position by marching their armies around. We're not going to simulate that. We're just going to generate it randomly on this table. But then I was like, hold it a second. I already have cards. I could put the terrain on cards, and then I'd have a deck that is dual purpose. It generates terrain. You can also use them to play the strategic level of generating your economic activity. But basically, you look at the difference between the commander-in-chief general's abilities, and that would influence how many draws from the card deck. And the basic system is you draw 2 cards, place 1 item on the field, and then the next guy draws 1 and places 1 item on the field. And at that time, it was just like with chainmail. I was thinking in terms of miniature wargaming terrain pieces that you'd place on the field. Working on it and working on it, I was, like testing the generation methods of drawing and like, okay, what mix of terrain pieces do I want and how frequent should they be? Because it's like I don't want everything to be weird things. Like it's not going to be all hills and rivers. I want it to be mostly plains or flat area or fields with it, a few unique things, mountains, hills, streams, a bridge, whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I was making cards and draft. I had a draft deck where I made a certain mix of cards and then laying them out. And I was like, I had this realization: hey, when I lay these cards out, they make a battlefield. And one thing about the 30 Years' Wars battles is that they're kind of ungainly battles. You have all these regiments and pike blocks that kind of line up and then march at each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's not blitzkrieg. It's not even Napoleonic, where you have big columns marching and people in lines trying to stop them and trying to break the lines. It's these big ugly units of regiments marching at each other and then clunking into each other to a large degree. And I was like, do you really need detailed miniature terrain for that? And I was like, when I lay out my cards, I can lay them out in 3 rows. The row that faces the player on each side is where they're setting up their forces. And then you have the middle ground where they come and meet. So that was one aspect. So I was like, I had this realization I could just play a game with the cards themselves without having to have a giant miniatures table or anything. Just lay out the cards and put minis on them. So that was one aspect of how it ended up with cards. The other thing was I soon realized I could dispense with minis, or maybe it's like at a certain scale, every mini games becomes a chit game.
Yes.
And because I was like, well, really, you could get into, if you're marching armies around, you're really talking about regiments, groups of regiments. And those regiments usually would consist of both pikes and guns to a certain extent. And so it's not really all that useful if you're talking at a regimental level to simulate moving your little arquebusiers along with your pikes. They could just move as a unit, and they're like, "Oh, that's a chit."
Right.
and
Right.
and similarly, I was looking at statistical outcomes of mass taking the Lamentations of Flame Princess combat system and scaling it up. And there's, like, how do you assess to hits versus damage versus casualties? There's different ways you can do it. And we've kind of talked about some of those things in other contexts, but I realized, well, a lot of people, when you're scaling up from individual to large scale, will I'm just going to take the average damage from the weapon versus the average hit points of the guys in the thing, which makes a lot of sense since you got, say, 1,000 guys, right? Well, you're not looking at a much variability, or the variability is lost in that average.
Right.
But then I realized the same can be said about the 2 hit rolls. So let's say you need based on the armor class of an opponent, let's say you need a 15 or better to hit. That's a 30% chance of hitting. So you could just say, when you have 100 guys fighting 100 guys, 30 of them are hitting. You don't have to roll, because that's 100 rolls, and on averages, you're going to get about 30. Sure, you could get a lucky run and get a bit more or a bit less unlucky run. But it's going to be about 30, and the weapon damage is going to be average, and the hit points of the guys are going to be average. And I'm like, oh, you don't need to roll at all. And so
a dirty little secret.
and so that made me go, oh, I want to make that. Inspired me to spin off of the Lamentations of the Flame Princess intersection to just an idea of a diceless 30 Years War where you lay out your cards based on the system and then you have chits, and on the bottom, the original idea was it'd be on the bottom of miniatures, you'd have the number. It'd be like Stratego, which number is bigger than the other guy's number, and then that guy wins, right? Then I was like, really, I want to have more units on a card, and miniatures are kind of big, so I'll just use hits that you can stack. And the upshot is that you'd have your chits on your card. I got 4 regiments of this, and they have this leader, and it influenced the outcome this way. And when I move into the next card that has the opposing player has his chits in there, you can just flip the chits over, count up the points, figure out the ratio of those chits, and have a combat results table that gives you the casualties. Or you could just say you take them all off, but I think that's too abrupt. I think you want a more granular depletion of forces.
Right,
So
because you want it to be a little more granular so that it can feel like there's not feel like, I don't want to use that word, so that tactics matter.
Yeah, and you have a degradation of ability versus just a total massacre, right?
Right.
The game would be very short. So that led to this idea of the diceless 30 Years War game. So I was working on that, and I realized, like, 30 Years War is actually kind of a complicated time period where a lot of tactics and procedures were being invented that later kind of came to their maximum fruition during the Napoleonic War. And so that then led to, I'm going to do the diceless Napoleonics first because it's a simpler set of units. Like in Napoleonics, you've got infantry, cavalry, guns, skirmishers, say, right? And you could get fancier, say, light cavalry and heavy cavalry, maybe rifles. But in 30 Years War, you have everything from matchlocks to wheel locks to early muskets. It's like there's a lot more variation of units from country to country, and of course that's an oversimplification of the Napoleonic era, no doubt. But I think as far as a small portable war game, the Napoleonic one would be easier than to represent than 30 Years War. And so that's kind of how I ended up with the cards. I was like, the more I boil this down, the more I'm getting to a game where I just have cards. I don't necessarily even need chits. I could have cards for the units as well. I don't know. It's not done yet. It might just end up being cards, and that'd be a very easy game to produce and sell too, in the sense that you can get card packs printed up, and they're easier to pack and easier to carry around, and it's very portable.
Right.
So
Which is a big consideration in war games, as well as if you're going to add a mass battle like that to your role-playing games.
yeah, and it's kind of gotten away from the role-playing game or the miniatures gaming aspect. It could still be applied to role-playing, though, in that the real goal is to come up with a system that is quick and easy to produce, something that fills in the background of what's going on around the characters that you're really playing in session, right? And so that might still feed back into the Lamentations idea that I'm still working on. So now I've got like a Napoleonics, a 30 Years War portable, both portable card game, the Lamentations 2 games. So now I have 4 different games that all of which are incomplete. So I think this plays into some of the things you were saying earlier. When earlier today you posted about from John Peterson's book about the development of Bronstein's and how it was point driven, and that led to this idea of experience points. There's a mission creep that happens as you play a game or as you develop a game that leads you to places that you didn't expect or didn't envision when you started.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it's funny because I've heard people say that developing a game takes about 2 years from initial idea to final thing. And I'm coming up on the second year anniversary of the Fantasy Grid project, and admittedly, it's been somewhat stalled for the last few months because I've gone headfirst into a bunch of research,
Yeah, and research can
both
go
both
forever.
for both for this and also for my various war game and role playing campaigns, um, which in my mind all of them are related, and so I have to be careful to try to keep them separated in my workflow as well as in my consciousness.
Yeah. And the thing with research is that it literally can go on forever. It's bottomless. There's always a fine detail that you find yourself intrigued by and go, oh, this might be critical. And
Oh yeah,
at,
absolutely,
at
absolutely.
some points
And
you gotta cut bait, and I feel
right,
that coming on.
right. Well, now that leads to my next question. With your research, and since you decided to go ahead and turn the cards into the battlefield, how did you choose the various terrain types that are available? And also, how did you choose the types of mechanical effects that they have on the course of the game?
Well, initially I started with the same terrain types ripped off from chainmail, because that was their initial kind of inspiration. But through doing the research about the 30 Years War and their battles, I started looking at the uh, historical battles and seeing just what were on their battlefields, right? Were there commonalities? Were there, what was the things that were rare that made, important contribution to the outcome of the battle? Um, Now, I can't say I did like unique statistical analysis of that,
Mhm.
but I did try to find unique features and find things that did historically contribute. And like for example, sometimes I won't be able to cite you which battles these are from, but there's some where just having a ditch somewhere totally threw a loop to what everyone was expecting, how they'd be able to maneuver on the battlefield. Or uh,
Right.
similarly, I can't remember what battle it was, but there was a battle where these guys started on this hilltop with the opposing army down below, and they charged down the hill. And what they didn't realize was at the bottom of the hill was a marsh.
Mhm.
And so suddenly they're all bogged down in this marsh, and the enemy just came up and, were able to fire into the marsh and uh, annihilate them. And they totally couldn't tell there was a marsh where they were charging down into, or didn't expect it for some reason. Even though, like, if you have a hill with water flowing down it, there's often pools of water at the bottom, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
that influenced some of the rules or some of the potential rules because this isn't done. But like, uh, for example, let me see if I can find my marsh rule. Um, uh, oh yeah, one of the placement rules is with marshes and swamp. It said if there's hills already on the game on the board, already laid out, and there's a space to place the marsh next to the hill, you have to place it next to the hill. And so that was just a something that was inspired by a real life event that said, okay, do it this way. But it also kind of purports to some level of realism that water flows downhill, right?
Right. Right. And that was, you actually anticipated my next question, which was about what things made it onto the cards with regard to historical considerations versus narrative considerations. And the marsh mechanic nails both of those.
Yes, similarly, as part of the rules, I have come up with a little bit of a uh, season because on the strategic game, each hand you played of French tarot, was a season. Um, and so you had the progression of seasons. And so then I had a weather generation method, which might end up on the cards too. That remains to be seen yet. One thing, once you start making a deck of cards, you start seeing how much stuff you can fit on your card. You can use the deck
Right.
to generate many effects, right? Um, and so uh, the the seasons could influence some of the cards. For example, in the winter, and you have a field, it might be muddy, or fall and winter, it might be muddy, or it might be muddy if cavalry proceeds across it. Um, and that was just inspired by my own experience of where I live. I hike in the woods, and those woods are also uh, shared with horses. There's not like lots of horses, but you come across maybe a couple people riding their horses on the trail every now and then, and sometimes it might be 3 or 4 people riding their horses. And it doesn't take many horses to make the trail all dug up and muddy.
Right.
um, and I started thinking, what would it be like if you had a whole, cavalry regiment going across a field? It's just going to turn it into a bog. And particularly if there's a lot of water already present. And so on my card, it'd be like, okay, if wet, it becomes mud, right? Um, and and similarly, like for plains versus plowed field, plains only became mud if cavalry crossed it. Fields become mud immediately if it's wet because they're plowed. Um, and similarly, I just tried to do some logical placements, which is um, for like the field card, I said, if there's a building present, then place the field next to the building because farms have farmhouses, right? Um, Similarly with the houses, it's like if there's a field present on the board, place it next to the field because farms
Mhm.
have farmhouses. Um,
Right. Right. Just
and
watch out for just watch out for the desert swamp.
well, yeah, exactly. And similarly, I came up with forests, and forests had different densities of, small, medium, large, essentially. Um, and you try to make, okay, you're not moving our cavalry through dense forest, um, or nor are you taking artillery in there, and it blocks line of sight, and it increases your ability to defend. You can hide amongst the trees. Um, or similarly, fortifications. Like here, I have a card that's a Star Fortress. Um, if you get near it, it stops horses from moving. Um, and any unit that has to take a leadership test to exit from it, because they'll come under fire from the fortress and get bogged down. But if you're in the fortress, you get lots of defense. So it really improves your ability to defend that card. Um, so there,
Okay.
a lot of
Now,
it
now
is.
speaking of cards like that,
Mhm.
um, is there a do you anticipate using different combinations of cards, or what cards are available in the deck to draw from based
I
on, the scenario or
I've
maybe the
thought of
scale? So if
I've
if
thought
you're
about
playing a scenario where there is no fortress, you pull the fortress cards out of the deck.
I've thought about that, but the and I it's not nothing set in stone. But my general idea was no, but it might the scale of the scenario might be more based on the size of hand you draw. You know, if you're doing like some skirmish game, you're not going to place as many cards as you do for a giant mini regiment battle. And so
Right,
that
but
will
at the same
naturally.
time, if you were doing, say, a company-sized battle versus a regiment-sized battle, um, would that have an impact? And say, for instance, that the scenario
Yeah,
generator says that these two company level forces meet in an area that's relatively uninhabited and open.
yeah.
So would you take out the hills, take out the mountains, take out the fortresses, take out the towns, things like that, and so that way you
I
have a more limited deck to draw from.
I think that's one option. Nothing certain at this point, but I think, to me, at first glance, I say no, because that's driven by the terrain placement choices that the commanders make. Because there's the commander's choice to draw cards and place cards, and rules relating to influencing the cards your opponent places. And so I think, like, let's say if you draw the fortress card, if you don't want to fight next to a fortress, um, you might choose to discard that. Or similarly, if you're the opponent, you might use some of your abilities to eliminate that card. Because that part of the game is simulating these various leaders jockeying for position, right? Trying to choose the
Right,
terrain
right.
and
Yeah, that
find
makes
the
that makes that makes sense.
and a defender, um, an attacker, obviously, particularly of a small unit attacking, probably isn't going to want to fight at the foot of a fortress if they don't have to. Now
Right.
they might if they might be forced into it somehow, right? So
Sure,
keeping that
sure, yeah.
option, keeping that option in the deck, I think makes some sense, because sometimes people get sucked into bad terrain, right? Bad terrain for them, and but I do agree that there's times where you're like, no, we're not fighting near anything like that, so we're out of there. Like if you're in northern Germany somewhere, maybe you don't do any mountains, right?
Right.
um, uh, so I do. That is nothing set in stone at this point, and I haven't really developed it that far yet to
Okay.
determine
And
that.
then
But I do think there could be regional eliminations from the decks. Like if you're in southern Germany, mountains might be just the thing. Northern Germany, not. Or France might be hills, a lot more. Um, so that might be part of the regional variation influenced by the strategic game, where you might discard some cards from the deck. But just off the first glance, I'm saying no, but there might be other rules to influence what you discard and what doesn't get discarded when you're placing terrain. Because all those things do make some sense to to limit it. One of the things I've been struggling with a little bit is even with the variety that I've included, it probably overrepresents the weird terrains over the humdrum terrains. Like there probably should be double the number of just fields and plains versus rivers and forests. Just because people generally will pick fields and plains to fight on versus in the middle of a
right.
forest. Um, but also just because I think that that's probably representative of what's really around. Um, so, you're kind of limited by the size of deck that you want to produce, and the tarot deck's already a big deck. I think it's 77 cards versus the normal 52. Um,
I think it's something like that.
and so,
Now, also, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead and finish.
um, but even still, I think I might revise the mixture of cards yet. It's nothing set in stone yet. I think even if once it's fully developed, well, not fully, once I have a playable game out of it, um, playtesting might influence that, right?
I would. Yeah, that's playtesting is a whole nother can of
Because
worms.
that's the scary part of developing a game at all, which is you might spend 2 years developing a game and then have a game that's not fun to play.
Right.
that
Right.
could
It's
that
more of
could
a
very well be the
theoretical
case.
exercise. It turns
I
into a
think there's
theoretical exercise.
I think that's actually probably true for most games that get developed, that most of them aren't fun to play and never get any farther. It's the classic what do they call it? The fantasy heartbreaker. The every role playing gamer is develops their own fantasy game at some point that never goes anywhere. One, because
Right.
it sucks and it doesn't, it's not fun to play, or it's so idiosyncratic to them that nobody else really cares or understands it. Um, I think I'm in the danger of that with my French tarot fixation, but I still
Yeah.
think it's fun.
Well, and you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and hit you with my own personal favorite pieces of war games, and that is what do you have in terms of rules for scouts and reconnaissance and for sieges?
Well, scouts and reconnaissance is all boiled into that commander game of picking the terrain, right? Because that's how you end up fighting with what you fight with. Um, so that's kind of the scouting is kind of wrapped all into that. Um, it's not simulated explicitly, but that's clearly part of like a good commander spends time developing scouts and doing scouts and listening to what his scouts say, and that influences how he picks the terrain he fights in. That's scouts. For sieges, um, well, not as much. Um, I think in the strategic game there will be choices between formal sieges versus you're having a battle that's has a fortress nearby. There's a distinction between those two. Whereas a formal siege, you're out there digging your trenches and making sure no one leaves and all that kind of thing. That will be part of the strategic game, and it'll be very abstract. So one of the things I want to look at is, I don't know if you're familiar, but there's a wargaming group called the Perfect Captain. They have a website, and they've developed quite a few wargaming rule set that you can just download of them and play them. And they have a system called Spanish Fury, which is, basically 16th century warfare during, the wars of religion. And they have a whole system, including a strategic system and a siege system that they developed for that. So it's one. I don't think I want to go to the same detail with sieges as they did, but I did want to read through that and see if there's any inspiration I could use to make a simple siege thing where um, uh, one could, on the strategic level, invest a city or a fort and take it without having to play it out. Because I mostly have found sieges to be not very interesting on the miniatures game board. They're kind of static, and you're usually throwing your guys piecemeal at a wall and having them get killed. And, it's not a very tactically interesting game. It's a bloodbath, but it's not
Right.
exciting in the same sense of trying to turn someone's flank or whatnot. Um, so that's kind of my thoughts. That's kind of preliminary because still writing it, but I didn't think of a really detailed siege system, but something kind of more abstracted.
Okay. Well, it's funny because sieges definitely um, they're kind of love them or hate them. I think in that there are some, like you said, fabulously detailed siege rules, but sometimes it can be difficult to believe, for some players to believe that the squeeze is worth the juice that you get out of that.
Yeah,
Personally, I think sieges are fascinating, and it's interesting to see the different abstracted siege methodologies that like Don Featherstone and Tony Bath have compared to the actual, figure by figure rules that you see in old Warhammer Fantasy Battle or the Warhammer historicals.
yeah, and it's interesting because if you look at chainmail and AD&D, clearly sieges were considered a significant part of those systems. They cover siege equipment, how to break down walls, all those kinds of things. So clearly, it seems like at that time they were playing out a fair amount of sieges. I mean, wouldn't that make sense?
Yeah.
Since
Oh,
they
absolutely, absolutely.
included all
And it's
those
also
rules, right?
there's a whole bunch of actual hex and chit siege games that you
Oh
can
yeah,
download for free from SPI. All those old games from the '60s. They're all available
yeah,
on PDF.
and even
So
more
you've got
modern ones. I got a pile of Hex and Chit World War II war games a little while back. There was a sale from this one manufacturer. I forget what the company was now, but and there's just like buy a whole bunch of our stuff in bulk kind of thing. So I'm like, sure, why not?
Mhm.
And I swear about half of those games are siege games. They're World War II, so they're like Stalingrad and other things like that. And I'm like, oh, those are I don't like sieges so much.
Well, yeah, but those are
And
different sorts of sieges. Those are,
yeah,
I
they
think,
are.
the
They're
more
much,
modern you get, the more dynamic a siege gets.
yeah, because the scale gets so big, it becomes tactical again, right? Um, and then, I guess it's like really still tactical. Like if you look at AD&D, the mining rules were built for sieges. so you can, it's multi-level in terms of it's not just the board game, it's under the under the board game. And um clearly there's, at whatever scale, since geography is essentially fractal, you can still use tactics. The question is, are those tactics interesting to you, or do they make for good gameplay? Because I guess I'm of two minds. Mostly I find sieges kind of static and boring, but maybe that's just because I haven't come across the game mechanic that is fun. Because like I said earlier, it's like, just because you develop a game doesn't mean it's a fun game.
Right.
and and
Right. And
and
it also depends on what resources you have too, because many, many, many years ago, back in the dark ages, um, I got my hands on the original Warhammer Siege book. And I want to say this was in the early mid 90s. And there was a whole group of us that used to get together on Saturdays and play Warhammer Fantasy Battle. And so we got together early one morning and set up castle and everything and set up all our forces and then played the siege at a breakneck pace, try to get through, in a whole day. Um, and that the speed run part of it kind of made it exciting, but also the fact that there were five, I want to say six, maybe six of us showed up with all of our armies. So we had plenty of figures, to fill up the
mhm.
castle and fill up the trenches around it and that sort of thing. And I remember
Yeah,
it
the
being
resources make a difference.
super fun, but I could not set something like that up at home now. And it certainly wouldn't look as epic as it did then.
Yeah, I hear you.
Six
Because, like,
guys each with 150 or 200 figures on the board. That's a spectacular game board.
yes, and that brings to mind, like this last weekend I was just at a miniatures convention, Enflod, which is held in Tacoma now. And in that convention, several of the more prominent games were sieges. There was a French Foreign Legion fort in Mexico, so it's French Foreign Legion versus Mexicans game, and then there was another one which was French Foreign Legion in Algeria versus Algerian Corsairs, but it was a siege in a city, and really nicely made terrain and models for the forts and city, and the production value and scale of miniatures brought onto the table certainly made a difference. Like, had those been played out with hex and chits, I think it would have been kind of humdrum game. But because you had the really sharp looking models and terrain and lots of figures that were painted to a decent degree, um, it really looked pretty fun. I didn't play in those games, but they looked like great games, right? Like, it looked like everyone had fun. It was interesting to watch and look at and see what they're up to. And just like how role-playing games developed with miniatures, you can become attached to specific figures that are, whatever, something dramatic happens, and that little guy in the sombrero, he withstood, five artillery barrages of of grape shot. What are the odds, right? You start rooting for him, right? Um, Things like that happens in miniature games. I think even more so than other types of games. Like, you can still root for a chit, but not as much as you root for a mini that has a face.
Right, right. No,
um,
you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct, and that's one of the things that I thought was so interesting about your cards. When you said you could play the game right on the cards, I had a picture in my head, because right now I'm building a table for the Mordheim 25th anniversary, and I'm using um, canvas boards, stretched canvas boards from the craft
mhm.
shop as the basis for some of the buildings. because they're nice and sturdy and you can glue to them, and they're thick, but they're stiff, but
Oh,
they're lightweight.
interesting.
They're light, much lighter than a piece of wood or a piece of MDF the same size. Um,
Mhm.
but the first thing that popped into my head was I can put my miniatures right on here. Was okay. Wow, what if I had a bunch of 8 by 10, terrain cards, as it were, with the terrain just painted on this little canvas.
And
I
lay them
threw
out.
them, and then I could play 15 or 25 millimeter miniatures on them a lot easier than you could on a playing card sized game board.
Well, yeah, and that's similar to like, like back, what was that called? There was that miniatures terrain system where they basically used closed cell foam to cut out hexes, and then you could lay out the hexes and build them up into hills and stuff. And
Yes,
in theory, you could, you know, create those with other terrain on them, and even print like mine, like with the cards. I started with a set of cards that just had pictures of the terrain on it. Then I was like, oh, I could just put the description of how they affect things right on the card. Then I know I don't have to look up the rule every time or look at a
right,
table of terrain effects chart. It's just on the card. um, and so that led it, and the other concept that was, that led to like the diceless Napoleonics was like, well, there is another diceless Napoleonics game. It's called Stratego.
right,
And I was like, oh, this is kind of like Stratego, except Stratego with a little bit more uncertainty because it isn't, in Stratego, each unit definitively wins or loses with each
right,
encounter. This would be like you have points associated with each unit, and it's the ratio of points that lead to the outcome.
right.
Um,
And Stratego's game board has fixed terrain,
right, and
which
this
would
would
be a
have
lot of fun.
variable
Be a
terrain.
lot of fun if you had variable terrain for the Stratego.
Yeah, maybe I should get a set of Stratego pieces and see how Stratego plays when laid out on my terrain cards. Because it certainly would mix up the strategies for Stratego a little bit more.
Do you have a Goodwill store near you?
Not really, but they're around. I can find one.
Okay,
It's
hit
usually
up Goodwill stores because I find I've got several Stratego games as well as a whole stack of Risk games that I've been accumulating in order to make effectively 6 millimeter stands for Napoleonics and
and
American Civil War style games.
and of the classic games, Stratego is one of those that has, due to its nature, has been very difficult to write um, computer programs to play it. Um, and even more so than uh, Go. And so I think that I saw an article a few months ago where someone had finally used, some of this our new artificial stupid algorithms to come up with a way to make an AI to play Stratego well that could beat people who are good at Stratego.
Ah,
And uh, it's only recently that we've had that capability. And so Stratego is a game that it surpasses some surprising depth despite its simplicity. And
yes,
and I think if you mix up the terrain and added more variability to the abilities of the Stratego pieces, like my Diceless Napoleonic, you'd have a game that would be much harder for the computers also to come up with a way to beat you.
right,
But
right. Yeah,
they could be neat.
I definitely think Stratego is an underrated game, and for it's ripe for somebody to have a game jam with Stratego and find out ways that you could make it more exciting or interesting, or innovate some kind of new things that you could integrate into the game to make it something more spectacular.
Yeah, it could be expanded. It's like in the last, I don't know, I guess since the 90s or late 80s, really. In the 70s and 80s, they had the game of Risk. And then in the late 80s, they started coming out with Risk variants.
Yeah.
Um, and some of which I think were really good. I think like the Samurai Swords slash Shogun variant is, I think, my favorite of the Risk variants. Um, but it showed that the simple system that was Risk has and continues to have a lot of promise for making variants of it in ways that are unique and interesting. Um, I think I played once I think it was a Buck Rogers version of Risk where you could go off into space to the moon and back and crazy stuff. So they had a separate little board for the moon. And uh
Yeah, I have that one. I have that one. It's fantastic. That's my favorite one.
and um I think Stratego has a similar sort of aspect that historically it's been a very rigid game with a very set board with very set pieces like chess, but it has a lot of potential um, for doing things in different ways with the same sort of mechanics.
Yeah, it is endlessly fascinating to me how the terrain rules for whether it's a board game, hex and chit game, miniatures game, role playing game, they have such a profound effect on the
Yeah,
gameplay itself. And so
well,
I think that's part of what's really bogging me down in my own game design. And I'm glad to see it's not just me. I'm glad that you're having trouble
oh
with it
yeah,
too.
it's not just
Because
you,
it's just and I just think it's endlessly fascinating. So I definitely want to, thank you for sharing all of this with us. Um,
for sure.
what do you think has been the most challenging part of designing this terrain system?
Well, I think focus. I've constantly revised it and turned it into different games. So I gotta I have to get to one game at least to get to a finished game that can really be extensively play tested. Um, I expect that it'll be the Diceless Napoleonics game, which will then, after playtesting that, will feed back into the 30 Years' War and back into the more generic miniatures game I intended for Lamentations of the Flame Princess. Um, but we'll see what happens. It's like uh, I think that's the biggest challenge is just getting things done because just like with research, development can go forever. Sometimes you have to say, okay, I'm done. Let's play this a bunch and see if it's any good. I think probably should be doing more of that because if it's not any good, you can just throw it out and start again. If it's no fun or sucks, then uh, uh, at a certain point, you might just say, oh, I just wasted a bunch of time on something that wasn't worth it versus, oh,
Right.
that mechanic really worked well. I like that. That was the fun one. Let's do more of that. um,
Well, I'll tell you what, when you're ready to put together, like a print and play kit for it, let me know and we'll go ahead and I'll share it out with my YouTube channel and my Substack and we'll see if anybody wants to
yeah,
download it and
try it out
play
and see what
test
they
it,
think.
see what they think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the other product that I've been working on, which is also a card-driven game, um, is a surfing game. And the idea with that one similarly started with miniatures of little surfers that you would place on the cars and has now evolved past having miniatures because I would just want a deck that you could sell as a deck. But basically, you lay out lines of cards of waves and you have a mechanism for flipping the waves over and seeing what the next wave is and then matching waves with tricks that you can do. You'd have a hand of trick cards and go, oh, what trick can I play on this wave that gets me the most points kind of thing. Um, And with a game mechanic, kind of like Millborn. Are you familiar with Millborn?
No.
Millborn is a French, I think it's French, um, road rally card game. It's basically a kid's game, but it's really a little bit of genius where you're trying to get to, I think, 1,000 miles. So you have miles cards, but then you have hazards cards and cards that trump the hazards. And so the idea is each character is a driver in a road rally race, and you're trying to play your miles cards, but then you can get stoplights that stop you, and then you have to get a green light card to play on the stoplight to make you go again. And you can get a flat tire or run out of gas or find gas, um and so you have a set of hazards and then the cards that are the solution to the hazards. And then you have trumps, which are cards which make you invulnerable to those hazards. So you're like, oh, I have run flat tires. I no longer am subject to flat tire cards. And you play them on your opponents, so you're like, okay, I don't have any miles cards to play this time, so I'm going to play a stop sign on my opponent. um, and so I think it's a great little fun game, and my surfing game will be kind of like that, where you have a mechanic for flipping over the waves and seeing what waves you can do, and then what tricks, and then your opponent might have hazards in their hand that they can play on you, like sharks or driftwood or whatever. So that's another
All right.
game that's in
Awesome.
development.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I'll have to bring you back on, and we'll talk about the surfing game.
Yeah,
Remind me about that.
ideally,
I'm gonna make a note right here, and I will contact you in 6 months for the surfing game.
yeah,
Okay, that's your
yeah,
deadline.
we'll see. Ideally, if I get it done, I want it in every surf shop in Hawaii. That's the one that
Well, you
that's
know
the one
what? We
that
know somebody. We know somebody in Hawaii.
exactly. And it's one that actually might make some money as a impulse buy, right?
Yeah, especially if you can get the cost down.
Yeah, that's why I want just a deck of cards and boom, play it. So anyway,
It'd be
that's
cool to play at the beach. It'd be cool to play at the beach. But that's a conversation for another podcast. So, hey,
yep.
thank you so much for coming on to Wargame Culture and talking about this. Um, I found it
Yeah,
extremely fascinating. I've got some great notes here that that we'll put into the show notes. Is there anything you want to throw out there as a as I'll give you the chance to get the last word?
well, I guess I just say that the other thing I do is I write for the publisher Pylon Press, and they have a Kickstarter right now for J.B. Jackson's sequel to his book Shag Duck that's titled Ursula of Ulm. I would suggest everyone back that one because it's going to be great. Um, Pylon Press, uh, Ursula of Ulm Kickstarter.
Awesome. Well, we'll throw that out there. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Everyone that's still here, be sure and hit like and subscribe if you're watching this on the YouTube. If you're not watching on YouTube, bounce over there. Be sure and hit that like button. Thanks again, everybody. Thank you to Fluid the Druid, and I look forward to talking to you this fall about the surfing game.
All right. Thank you very much.